Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week is Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. Bureau Chief of the Strait Times. Nirmal, always great to have you. And from Brussels is coming is Steve Erlanger, who is the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Steve, great to have you back.
Thank you.
And from Washington, D.C., Susan Glasser, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker. Susan, wonderful to see you again. Well, quite a week it was. The biggest news story by far around the world is not on our agenda. It was the rise and fall of the Super League, the European Football League, in which 12 billionaires decided they were going to disenfranchise the fans of European soccer from around the world. It took all of 48 hours for the entire thing to collapse. It's a huge story around the world. Nirmal, last time I was in Singapore when the Premier League was playing, the bars and restaurants were overflowing with fans. It is that big. Was there any reaction to this in Singapore? You're still muted.
Absolutely. I mean, our sports pages are full of it. I personally haven't followed it, but yes, absolutely. I mean, there's so many fans in Singapore. I remember when I moved to Singapore way back in '91, I was amazed because it was a completely different universe from India where, they all play cricket.
Yeah, no, and it's like, it's like taking the cricket and saying that there are only a few clubs that now need to play each other. Steve, I think you were mentioning one comment that really went to the heart of the problem that you heard.
Well, I lived in Britain off and on for 9 years, and the Premier League matters, and football matters, and Pep Guardiola, great coach, another foreigner but working in the Premier League, said, "What kind of sport is it that when you lose, nothing happens?" And this was intriguing because it's all about relegation. You have to do well each year to get into the championship leagues. And the whole idea of creating a league in a way, the American style. I mean, baseball doesn't lose teams, and American football doesn't lose teams, even if they're bad. But there was just this sense that somehow the American model was infecting Europe just the way American coffee has. And there was a lot of tut-tutting, particularly from the British tabloids, about the infection of American models and how we've defeated them again.
Well, speaking of never losing, that maybe is a great segue to our next topic, which is Susan, which is Russia, which, by the way, of course, hosted the World Cup in 2018, which is one way the Russians were able to qualify. Cheating tends to be the other way in which that often happens, and that sort of goes to the heart of what we've been seeing this week in Russia. Big speech by Putin, his annual address. Escalation and now de-escalation with Ukraine, escalation and now de-escalation with regard to Alexei Navalny. Sort of give us your take, Susan, as you were watching this evolution over the week, both of sort of how you saw this change and what do we interpret that? Is Putin playing a strong card or a weak hand?
That, amazingly enough, has been the question about Vladimir Putin really for the last 20 years that he's been in power. I'm relieved we switched from football to Russia. I'm having like a sort of Ted Lasso moment here. But let me just say that when it comes to Putin, first of all, it's important to note for people that it's not quite over yet. So let's see what the withdrawal brings. The moments of coming and going are still very fraught moments, especially when you're talking about 110,000 approximately military personnel, according to Western sources. That's the size they believe of the Russian buildup that was occurring along this very fraught border with Ukraine. And so what happened yesterday is these massive exercises. Russia says they're concluded. We've proven our readiness and we're sending the troops home. However, we're leaving certain heavy weaponry pre-positioned here. And so again, I think the question of what was the goal of this, what was the aim, is one that's very important. There are a couple of things that obviously suggest are related to this. Number one is Vladimir Putin's desire to provoke and to test the new government here in Washington, the new president, Joe Biden, who has come into office, on the one hand, taking a much tougher line personally toward Vladimir Putin and Russia. On the other hand, imposing a new set of sanctions, for example, on the solar winds hacking that occurred, massive Russian government intrusion into the United States. Last year, the Trump administration did nothing about it. Donald Trump denied essentially the findings of his own intelligence agencies once again. So, this is the sort of geopolitical context, it seems to me, of Putin. He has a long record that Biden is now Putin's 5th United States president. So, he's dealt with Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. And so I think this is actually pretty well run in the playbook of the Russians to want to show, first of all, to prove to the Ukrainians that the United States is not really the sort of fail-safe guarantor of their security at this point, that the U.S. and the West sometimes claims to be, that U.S. promises toward Ukraine and others in the region might be hollow. And that definitely would be one goal of this. The other, of course, is distraction. And Vladimir Putin's situation inside Russia and his domestic political situation, is very, very charged at the moment, between the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, who is perhaps the most significant or the only real significant political dissident who represents an actual political threat to Vladimir Putin. He's been on a hunger strike for the last few weeks, and just today, on Friday, has announced that he will be giving up his 3-week-long hunger strike. He's finally been allowed to see civilian doctors and not just the Russian prison medical authorities. They weren't his own doctors, which is what Navalny said was a condition of ending his hunger strike, but his own doctors have been pleading with him publicly for the last couple of days and saying that if he does not give up the hunger strike, he will die. That's caused great alarm here in Washington and in other capitals. So, again, it could be a mixture of all of these motives. One thing that someone who is a wise Putin watcher said to me the other day is, listen, Putin, when he started on this buildup, may not have known himself exactly what the end game is. He is always about hedging his bets. He likes to keep his options open. Now, as another very senior former U.S. official told me yesterday, remember, this comes at a cost for Vladimir Putin. It's not cheap to send 110,000 military soldiers on an exercise like this. So number one, there can be a use it or lose it quality to this. You're not going to do this over and over again. So that's worrisome. But number two, that's an awfully costly message to send. If that is what he's doing, that's an awfully costly message to send here to Joe Biden and his new administration.
That's great overview there, Susan. Steve, Putin in his annual address to the nation had some very heated rhetoric for the West, talking about drawing red lines and making clear that anyone getting close to those red lines, they would hit back, threatening once again with new nuclear torpedo and hypersonic missiles. And just saying, we're there. When the Europeans reacted to this, I think my sense, this and the Ukraine buildup that Susan described, you got a sense that the Europeans at least were united. They wanted the thing to go away, but at least they were united, and they weren't going to be intimidated by the kind of rhetoric that was and the actual actions that were taking place in Russia. Is that a right way to think about it?
It is mostly right. I mean, they are sometimes divided. I mean, in the sense that the Hungarians, the Italians, the Greeks tend to be a little more pro-Russian. Sometimes the French too, by the way, a little more understanding. But in this case, Ukraine had them very nervous. I think Susan's absolutely right. It's not over. It's not at all over. And part of, the intention, at least seen here, from Putin was to issue another warning to Belarus, because he's very worried about Belarus, and a big warning to Zelensky to stop screwing around with my favorite oligarchs, because Zelensky has been doing that, and he's been trying to get closer to the Biden people after his nightmare with the Trump administration. And the other thing that happened is the same people, the same GRU guys who tried to kill Sergei Skripal were discovered to have been responsible for blowing up an arms depot in the Czech Republic in 2014. So you've had, now the Czech Republic has been really infiltrated by Russian spying for a long time. The Russians loved Karlovy Vary and so on, but the Czechs threw out 20 Russians, and then the Russians responded. There are only 5 Czechs left in their entire embassy now. And then the Slovaks threw out a couple of Russians out of sympathy, and so did the Baltics. So Russia's in this confrontation, which is not very pleasant, I think. The other thing, of course, Putin has to worry about, when he talks about red lines, he doesn't define what they are, right? So that's the problem with red lines. If they're actually not painted anywhere, it's hard to know when you're crossing over them. But clearly, knowing his history, his red lines have to do with Belarus, have to do with Ukraine, have to do with his belief, and I think he really does believe this, that the West is out to take these away from Russian influence, and if it could, to create the same kind of orange revolution, color revolution in Moscow itself. I mean, I think he really does believe that Navalny is a cat's paw of American intelligence and so on. Now, the other thing I would say, and I don't mean to go on about this, but Biden, this got a good phone call to him from Biden, right? Which was, I think, partly led to the de-escalation. It also led to the promise of a summit meeting, which I think Putin would like. But if I know anything about the way these things work, Biden also said to him privately in very clear terms, if you go into Ukraine, this is what's going to happen, X, Y, Z, etc. Now, we won't know what those are unless they're leaked. But I mean, I think there was a pretty strong warning that Putin heard and was given the summit at the same time. So, let's see, posmotrim, it's not over, but it's still a very tense time, I think.
All good points, and let's put it this way: if we ever get the transcript of the Biden-Putin phone call, we'll be discussing it here on World Review.
Susan will get it.
Well, it used to be easy to get presidential transcripts in a different administration, not that long ago. But this is a more disciplined administration for sure. Nirmal, it strikes me there is a parallel here of trying to test both the United States and the Biden administration, and to declare this sense of ownership of the region. When you look at China, and particularly what's happening with Taiwan, at the same time that the Russians were building up their troops in large numbers, and I note one of the places, parenthetically, to look at whether this is a serious retreat from where they were is what's happening to the assault ships and the large military presence both in the Crimea and in the Black Sea. But that's parenthetical, just as something to watch. We're seeing very aggressive action by the Chinese in the Taiwan Straits, ignoring the Taiwan air defense zone with bombers and others flying in there. And a very senior former intelligence official in Europe the other day at a meeting suggested that he thought that the Russians and the Chinese may be coordinating their military activities as a means to suggest the two-front confrontation and really pin down the Biden administration. What are you seeing in this region, and how do you look at that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know about coordinating the military acts, but certainly on a larger front, I mean, they have a lot in common. Both President Putin and Xi Jinping are, authoritarian, revisionist. Their main preoccupations are regime survival. They're both allergic to Western criticism of their systems, and of course, their repression. They share an ideological commitment to creating a sort of post-war, post-Western global order. And this sort of gained momentum after 2014 when Russia seized Crimea from Ukraine. And since then, China is Russia's #1 trading partner, buys a lot of weaponry, energy ties are expanding. So yes, absolutely. I think in terms of certainly of diplomacy and broader strategy, they would coordinate. In terms of the military, I'm not entirely sure because China has its own issue with Taiwan. It's a very, very, very specific particular issue. And yes, China has been increasingly aggressive. But on the other hand, I think it's important to look at the immediate context, which is that China has the Olympics coming up. Xi Jinping has a big anniversary coming up. I don't think it's in Xi Jinping's interest to start a war over Taiwan, to invade Taiwan. And then we have to get into the question of what does the United States do? So the US is, famously has this position of strategic ambiguity, which is actually useful. We were talking about red lines earlier, that Putin hasn't drawn a red line, right? Neither has the US with Taiwan, and that keeps China guessing. Now, of course, it's a very, very thin line that the US is walking, and Taiwan is walking as well. But I don't think a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is imminent, not for maybe 2-3 years at least. On the other hand, you could say that there are elements in the PLA who will say we should do it now rather than wait for Taiwan to sort of build up its defenses even more. The asymmetric defense capability that Tsai Ing-wen has been talking about with US help and all that. So it's a little tense over there. But again, going back to your question, no question that the China-Russia relationship has become increasingly robust. And it is because of this sort of belief that, they're both revisionist powers and they want to restore the lost glories of their respective countries. And they see the West as in decline.
I think we'll have to watch this very closely. I think the point you're making, Nirmal, about the alignment of interest and therefore also the closer alignment of these two countries and their leaders is an issue that I think we're ignoring in the US debate because our focus is so much on the competition with China that a two-front confrontation is something that the White House hopefully is paying attention to and keeping focus on as we go on. Yes, Steve, you want to jump in?
Sorry, just one quick point that fascinates me, which is the Russians are worried about China too, right? I mean, China is very powerful. The Russians are feeling weak by comparison. We're not doing a very good job at trying to separate them. But Xi Jinping does believe very strongly that China is on the rise, the West is in decline, and he is pushing. I think Russia in this case sees itself as part of the West that's in decline. And I think there are a lot of people in the Kremlin who are very nervous about this aggressive tone coming out of China also. You just have to look at the Russian Far East, the number of Chinese already living there. It's extraordinary. I mean, we don't write enough about that either.
No, I think a good corrective to the argument. And maybe what we need is a new Nixon-Kissinger strategy where we try to divide the two and in order to compete more effectively. But again, for another day, let me shift over to a different continent and a different place, Steve, Africa, and the remarkable news that on the same day that the president of Chad, Idriss Déby, was re-elected for, I think, the sixth time with 79% of the vote. I don't know if there's who got the other 21%. Is kind of an interesting question. He was killed, either assassinated or a casualty at the front as the Chadian military was fighting a growing rebel force. What do we know about what is happening, and more importantly, what does this tell us about what is happening in this region, which has been in so much turmoil for so long, including first 20 years ago in Sudan, and of course in the last 10 years with Libya, both neighbors of Chad, as civil wars and conflicts have become bigger. And of course, this is also the Sahel, an area in which France in particular has real strategic interest and longstanding strategic interest. So Steve, what do we know about what happened, and why do we need to pay attention?
Well, you've summarized some of it very, very well. I mean, you look at it in concentric circles, and when you begin to look at the death of Idriss Déby, the circles get wider and wider, because we don't know how he died. I mean, he came up as a poor kid, and he came up through the military and liked being a general and has been to the front before. So it is possible that he was actually killed at the front, but one really doesn't know. He had just been reelected, as you say, to the sixth term. But why did he matter? When you look across Africa, it's this incredible belt of instability and Islamic radicalism and anger. You know, Chad and Déby were very important, not just for the French, but helping the Nigerians against Boko Haram. I mean, he fought in Nigeria. He sent his army into Libya. It's the French campaign against against radical Islam. Operation Barhan is based in Chad. Chad is basically a French protectorate, and Emmanuel Macron, is actually in Chad today at the funeral of Idriss Déby. And despite the Chadian constitution has blessed the son of Idriss Déby, who's 37, to be his successor. So, I mean, Chad has been really crucial for French policy in Africa, which is a whole other topic. We could spend an hour just discussing that. But the French military involvement in Mali, which is not bordering but is quite close, against Islamic revolution there, against Islamic State in Africa, it's been crucially dependent on a very good Chad army. So the death of Déby, who'd been propped up by the French came to his aid against rebels twice before, is a blow to French policy. And it's also interesting to me, and here it's another indication of the chaos that was created in Libya when the West decided in all its glory to get rid of Gaddafi, to intervene in a civil war in Libya on one side. And it turned out to be a side that had a lot of radical Islamic adherents in the East. And Libya is now a complete failed state. It's a mess. And where do these rebels who supposedly killed Déby, where were they centered? From bordering Libya. They were marching down to the capital from Libya. So you see in the death of Déby, all these very important policy concerns. They stem from the failures of the past, they stem from colonial history, but they have a real impact on on Europe because Islamic radicalism, migration, desertification, all these issues, they are very much in the European neighborhood, and they are considered a real strategic interest, not just of France, but of the entire southern part of Europe. If I haven't confused you enough, I'll stop.
No, I think that was very clear. But to confuse a little further, Susan, not as well known is there's a U.S. interest in this part of the world, and in fact, a significant military presence in this part. We have a base for drone activity in Niger. We have training forces in Chad itself, and of course, the U.S. has been underpinning the French ability to conduct its military operations in a whole variety of ways. And so how is Washington reacting to this story? Is it seeing as a turning point for its presence there, or something to lean in on and see if we can maintain our influence?
It's a good question, Ivo. I mean, I think this is an example of something that just hasn't in recent years, probably not since the big incursion of the Islamic State in Mali, a number of years ago during the Obama administration. Really, since then, it's been a below the radar issue. As you know, Donald Trump had no truck with and no interest in policy toward Africa. I'm not sure he ever, after his disastrous reference to, shithole countries, I'm not sure he ever, said the words Africa in public again, frankly. But that being said, the U.S. military, as you point out, has seen cooperation with governments, even flawed governments in the region, as being a key aspect of its counterterrorism strategy in recent years, counter-militant strategy as well. And I think you're right to spotlight that it wasn't just the French, but the U.S. that considered to be a partner, and that shoring up his military in particular was a key part of U.S. strategy there, and the emergent AFRICOM, which was, again, something that was kind of threatened in the Trump years, but never directly undermined. And so I think, the U.S. basically, Joe Biden has made it clear, this is not his priority. He has a very experienced team overseeing foreign policy. But it strikes me that, especially in a first year characterized and marked by such crises and chaos, that what they're looking to do is essentially to maintain, to outsource, in effect, the key frontman diplomatic relations to Macron in this area. I think that's what we're going to continue to see. It is a hangover and a legacy of the sort of post 9/11 war on terror. And I do feel that the tectonic plates in Washington here are shifting to a certain extent around that framework as a governing framework for thinking about national security. And so, over time, you may see a shift and a pulling back, but I don't think there's any appetite for a major shift of any kind right now, and really just probably a quailing at the prospect of, adding yet another crisis to the agenda. I mean, even Russia, I think, was looked at to a certain extent that way when Putin began this buildup that we talked about earlier this hour. So, that gives you a sense of the very rigorous prioritization that's happening right now from the new Biden team.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And the tasking that came from the White House to the Defense Department to look at our global footprint militarily and see if we can readjust it with, frankly, a China first, second, and third focus may well lead to a reassessment of our presence in this part of the world. Nirmal, there are two other players in Africa. Russia, of course, has been trying to create a foothold in this part of the world, and indeed turns out that these Chadian rebels in the end were training, or were based, maybe not training, but based in the same place that the so-called Wagner, sort of informal but really Russian supported forces in Libya. And China has had a humongous interest in this part of the world, mainly for raw material extraction and investment. Do Do you have a sense of what the Chinese, how Beijing is looking at this, whether this matters to them, and or how Moscow is looking at this?
I think it matters to both, but China in particular will be reluctant to be dragged in. I mean, as Stephen was saying, it's a French problem. And this is quite interesting, actually. France is the only, I've always been intrigued by this, that France is the only former colonial power that actively intervenes in several of its former colonies. It's quite fascinating, it sends, expeditionary forces, airstrikes, the whole works. I mean, they saved Idriss Déby, right, from the rebels in 2000, I think it was early 2019, I think, with airstrikes. So I don't think China is going to be allow itself to be dragged in. Again, China has a lot of issues in countering international public opinion about what's going on in Xinjiang. It has economic problems. It has the Taiwan thing, which we talked about. It has to keep its foot on pro-democracy elements in Hong Kong. And so it has a lot to deal with, and it's not going to allow itself to be dragged in. Russia might find an opportunity to do that. So, it is really very much a French problem. And I think Macron has a serious problem to deal with, I would say.
Well, it's an area that I think bears more watching than maybe we have done in the past, in part because the kind of conflicts may occur not only with the French but with the Russians in the area. And as we think about creating spheres of influence, and China and the United States refocusing their attention elsewhere, other vacuums appear that may be filled by these kinds of powers. So bears watching. Let's switch to the other big story of the week, Nirmal, of course, the summit that the United States is convening, because it's still ongoing, yesterday and today, 40 countries to address what is our largest long-term crisis in the world, the climate crisis. A remarkable meeting that showed that even the White House can have problems with Zoom. So we're not the only ones when it comes to technology to have that problem. But here was Biden, less than 100 days into his presidency, able to convene 40 of the most important climate leaders in the world to discuss this crisis in anticipation of the big international conference in Glasgow later this year. Nirmal, you were watching it, I know, and tweeting about it. What happened in the meeting yesterday, and to the extent you know what's happening today, and what's your takeaway from it?
Well, my principal takeaway is that after several sort of inadequate starts in previous years, I was at COP15 in Copenhagen, which was an utter disaster. So this time we actually have a real beginning. I mean, President Biden's commitment to halve carbon emissions by 2030 is ambitious, no doubt about it. The highlights from yesterday, which saw all the leaders, Japan said they'd cut emissions 46 to 50% by 2030, up from 26% right now. Canada will cut emissions from 30 to 40 to 45%. South Korea will stop financing coal overseas, will update also its national goals. India has got this huge project which it wants to do with the US on renewable power, which would put it on track for the 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial warming. Right now we are on track for 3 degrees, which is a disaster. And the European Union, of course, as well. But as you said, there are 6 months left for COP26 in Glasgow, and that is when we will actually see if all these promises will actually amount to legally binding commitments. So I think President Biden has, to a large extent, grabbed the stage again. He's turning the ship around, and given the support from several business sectors in the US, including some of the big oil companies, there is, they see the writing on the wall, and there is no reason to believe he will dilute the US position, because this is well recognized, as you said, the biggest crisis, an existential threat and all that. As for others, though, a lot of countries did preserve some wiggle room. I mean, China made ambitious noises, but it has been adding coal. Last year, it added more coal generation to its mix. Let's face it, Xi Jinping is not interested in making Joe Biden look good. And as for Australia, for example, Prime Minister Morrison has been hammered in Australia for apparently playing fast and loose with the data. And then we have the financing issue. I mean, mitigation is one thing, but adaptation is quite another. If you see the Arctic is warming faster than any other place and is not going to refreeze, there's not going to be a net refreeze. So we are already way behind in our response, and we need to make infrastructure, human and climate infrastructure, climate resilient, infrastructure, climate resilient. So rich countries can afford it, of course, so many poor countries cannot. And if that gets out of hand, it'll only trigger internal and international migration and political tension, humanitarian issues, and so forth. And let's not forget the pandemic, which is still with us, and the recovery is quite uneven. And it has put a huge dent in a lot of major economies. Well, the good news, of course, is that President Biden announced that the US will double by 2024 its annual public climate finance to developing countries, double the level from the sort of latter years of the Obama administration. It'll triple public financing for adaptation by 2024. The idea is, to steer capital towards climate-aligned investments and so forth. But there are two questions. One is, of course, Glasgow, and the other is that what happens. Joe Biden has been doing a lot by executive order. So what happens if the Democrats lose the White House and another administration comes in, right? So that's always a question. I think his jobs promise. Joe Biden has a very narrow window domestically. His jobs promise has to show results, and humanity at large has a very, very narrow window generally. So if this year is going to be, frankly, make or break, Glasgow is going to be make or break. I'm curious as to whether you all fall on the optimistic side of this.
Susan, to the domestic politics, it's one thing to promise a almost near doubling in the reduction of greenhouse gases in 9 years. It's another to get there. You can do a bunch with regulation, but ultimately you need Congress. You need legislation in order to get stuff done. How do you see the debate in Washington? Is there a shift? Of course, the younger generation is living with this and they're becoming more powerful. And yet, are people willing to make the changes in their lives that getting there necessitates?
Well, I think the words climate change and optimism are not generally paired in the same sentence, Nirmal. So sadly, I can't fall down on that. I do think, Ivo, that there is a political shift that's occurring that is somewhat generational. I think there are probably younger Republicans as well as Democrats who have a different view about the environment than the sort of what looks to be unyielding climate denialism that you saw from the Republican Party in the last few years and reflected in the policies of the Trump administration. So I do think there's a shift. How quickly does that match up with the timetable, the unfortunately accelerating timetable of the actual consequences of climate change, which were now beginning to manifest themselves? It strikes me, at a faster and faster pace. So that's one big worry. Even aside from the sclerotic politics here in Washington, I think you're right that executive action is limited in terms of what Biden can do, and also isn't actually going to be enough to hit the scale of the problem or potentially to last, given the very real prospects of a change in administration again in just a few years. So that's one thing. And then, remember, in terms of Congress, it's not only the question of getting whatever you can get through this particular conference, this particular Congress, but there are at least a 50-50 chance that Republicans take back the House of Representatives, not in 4 years, but in 2 years. And so that's another political dynamic shaping things. However, there's some optimism, I would say, on the infrastructure / jobs part of it for this reason, which is that's the most bipartisan appealing part of what Biden has proposed. And there is, even if the entire package doesn't go through, that is the most likely alternative that could garner support from at least enough Republicans to get through the US Senate. So if you look at what the Obama administration did with its stimulus package, which was a heavy emphasis on green jobs and, climate friendly initiatives, that's likely to be the case here, even if the package is pared back to an infrastructure focused, a traditional infrastructure focused thing. So, I think the chances of legislative action are not nil, not at all. And they would certainly represent probably the most climate friendly, and progressive piece of legislation, in many, many years, given that Obama stimulus package was at the very beginning of his tenure in 2009. So prospects are real for something. And then I would just pull back, looking at that climate summit yesterday and seeing how quickly there were some technical difficulties in the execution in the Zoom era, but how quickly the new Biden team was able to pull that off with 40 heads of state who all said yes before 100 days had elapsed. The radical difference in surround sound. The U.S. actually not only making commitments of its own, but working and pressuring countries like Japan to up the ante in terms of their pledges. So being a constructive force on diplomacy, we all know the enormous energy that John Kerry brings to bear in his negotiations, and so that's a pretty big difference from where we were 6 months ago.
Steve, pick up on that excellent point by Susan. And this question, the administration clearly is making the case that this shows not only the importance of American leadership, that America is back, but that they now got no other country could have done anything like this, and the rest of the world is going to follow the United States in the glorious tradition of the leader of the free world. Is that how people in Brussels are talking about this, which, by the way, is far more ambitious even than the United States and has legislated accordingly, let alone the UK, which is even more ambitious when it comes to these issues? Are they going to take Biden's word for it, or how do they look at that issue?
Well, everybody's happy that a president who was a climate denier is no longer in the White House, right? And I think they're quite happy. Biden isn't going to start subsidizing the American coal industry all over again, right? So, but I think people were a bit amused. And even in my own paper in print, we had this notion that Biden was leading the way and getting the allies to go along. Well, in fact, the US is following, it's not leading. The European Union has been, one of the things it's done well has been to press very hard on getting to terms legally with a cut of 55% of carbon since 1990. Now, the US uses 2005, which makes the American figures look better than they actually are. But it's, the US is so big, to have Biden doing it, it's just wonderful. I think that's the way people feel, because it's a global problem. I was also struck by the first reaction of people like Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate, who were sort of saying, yeah, well, this is just giving China a pass, right? Because we're going to commit to do all this stuff and the Chinese are going to keep, burning coal. And it is certainly true that Chinese and the Indians too, together with the Americans, we tend to produce most of the carbon. So there's a lot to be done, but the Chinese don't want to choke to death either. And they are, while they're burning more coal, they're also hugely advanced in terms of solar energy. They're working very hard on electrical cars. They're taking it pretty seriously. But I think one of the things the summit has helped us all understand, which is very, very hard to swallow, which is the way our lives will have to change if these promises are going to be kept. Because particularly in America, the use of the car, the electricity has to be produced somehow. It raises questions again about nuclear power, because that's carbon free. There are all kinds of questions about how our future will look like. That's the best part of using the presidential bully pulpit, which is to get the world to concentrate. And then we'll see, much as Nirmal said, I mean, COP26 is now, I guess, in November. It's been postponed because of the virus. It's a big event for the British. They want to show off. They'll have lots of countries there. It'll be a very powerful moment. But promises and binding actions, that's the way the world ends, I'm afraid. This is what really worries me.
Well, I think that's where to conclude, where Nirmal started. The window is very tiny. And a lot of people have got to be able to worm themselves through it in order to get onto the other side and keep to the 1.5 degree temperature rise.
I think I mean,
Take a lot of work. Nirmal, final point. We're about to have to get off.
oh yeah, we're about to log off. So it's okay. I just think that, you know, what Stephen said, I mean, our lives will have to change, but they're going to have to change anyway. If we can't tap the brakes on this, they are going to change remarkably, and by force. We have no alternative.
Yeah, and in some ways, perhaps for the worse. It's one thing to have to buy an electric vehicle, and it's quite another thing to have to move inland because most of the water has overtaken New York and Manhattan. So yes, there is, in that sense, that is certainly true where change happens. We'll be there whenever we move in one direction or the other. I want to thank Nirmal Ghosh of the Strait Times, Stephen Erlanger of the New York Times, and Susan Glasser of the New Yorker for yet another great conversation about what was happening in the world. We ranged far and wide, from football to Chad to climate change to Putin. We'll do it again another week, and we'll want to thank everyone for tuning in. And for now, bon weekend, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.